Hello friends, welcome back to another sleep story. Somewhere beneath the waves of the Iron Sea, the ruins of a palace sit silent, buried under meters of volcanic ash. In the deserts of Syria, the foundations of what was once the world's first empire are slowly dissolving back into the sand. In the jungles of Cambodia, stone temples the size of modern cities are being swallowed by roots and time. These weren't small villages or struggling outposts. These were powerful, sophisticated, thriving civilizations, some of them the most advanced cultures on Earth at their time. And then, in what amounts to barely a blink in human history, they were gone. Tonight, we're going to visit 10 of them. Not the famous collapses you learned about in school, not the ones with clean explanations and tidy endings, but the ones that still haunt archaeologists. The ones where entire populations vanished so completely that for centuries we didn't even know they existed. The ones where the cause is still debated, still uncertain, still quietly terrifying. Because here's what makes these stories so unsettling. These weren't primitive people who didn't know any better. They built irrigation systems, astronomical calendars, trade networks spanning thousands of miles. They had architects and administrators and poets, and none of it was enough. Before we go any further, if you're listening right now and you're trying to wind down, trying to let your mind drift somewhere interesting before sleep pulls you under, that's exactly what this is for. Drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. Seriously, I read them. Last week, it was Cape Town at 2 in the morning, sitting next to someone with insomnia in Melbourne. It's strange and wonderful all at once. And if you want these completely ad-free with no music interruptions, I'm on Spotify. The link is in the description. Following there is genuinely the best way to support what I do here. Also, if you want to go deeper into stories like these, there's a book over at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's actually a discount running this week. So, worth checking out before it disappears like, well, everything else in tonight's episode. Alright, 10 civilizations, 10 catastrophes, and almost no trace left behind. Let's begin. 1. The Minoan civilization and the Thera eruption. Picture the ANC around 1,600 billions. CE. Not the tourist destination it is today, not the postcard blues and whitewashed walls. Picture it as a living, breathing network of commerce and culture, the way a modern city feels from above at night, lights connecting to lights, movement everywhere, a system so alive it seems like it could never stop. At the center of that network was Cree, and at the center of Cree was a civilization so sophisticated, so unexpected that when archaeologists first started pulling it out of the ground in the early 20th century, they genuinely didn't know what they were looking at. They called it Minoan, named after the legendary King Minos, and the more they dug, the stranger and more impressive it became. The Minoans had running water. They had multi-story palaces with indoor plumbing and drainage systems. They had fresco, vivid wall paintings of dolphins and bull leapers and goddesses painted with a confidence and a joy that feels almost startlingly modern. They had a writing system, 2 of them actually, one of which we still cannot read. They had a trade network that stretched from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Western Mediterranean, moving copper and tin and pottery and timber and textiles across the whole known world. And they did all of this without much evidence of fortification. No great walls around their cities, no moats, no military architecture to speak of, which is either a sign of extraordinary confidence or extraordinary naivety. And the answer to that question might be wrapped up in what happened to them. Because roughly around 1600 BC, possibly a little later, the debate on the exact date is genuinely still ongoing. Something happened about 110 kilometers north of Crete on an island called Thera, which we now call Santorini. A volcano that had been building pressure for centuries finally let go. And when it did, it didn't just erupt, it exploded. Geologists call it a Plinian eruption, after Pliny the Younger, who described the eruption of Vesuvius in terrifying detail. But the Thera eruption dwarfed Vesuvius the way a hurricane dwarfs a thunderstorm. The caldera that collapsed into the sea during the eruption was enormous. The ash column would have reached into the stratosphere. Modern estimates suggest the eruption released energy equivalent to hundreds of thousands of atomic bombs concentrated into hours. It ranks among the largest volcanic events in human history, and it happened at the center of one of the most densely interconnected civilizations the ancient world had ever produced. Here's where it gets genuinely difficult to wrap your mind around the scale of it. Ash from the Thera eruption has been found in ice cores from Greenland. It's been found in sediment samples from the bottom of the Black Sea. It shows up in archaeological sites across the eastern Mediterranean. A thin white layer pressed between older and newer soil, a timestamp written in volcanic glass. When you core down through thousands of years of accumulated sediment, and you hit that layer, you know exactly where you are in time. That layer is one of the most reliable chronological markers archaeologists have for the entire Bronze Age. But the ash was almost the least of it. When a volcanic caldera of that size collapses into the ocean, the water displacement is catastrophic. The seafloor shifts and the sea responds the way any fluid responds to a sudden violent disruption. It moves fast in all directions at once. The tsunamis generated by the collapse would have radiated outward across the iron like ripples from a stone, except these weren't ripples. Geological surveys of the Iron coastline have found tsunami deposits. Layers of marine sediment pushed far inland, mixed with pumice from the eruptions sitting in places where the sea has no business being on the northern coast of Crete. Researchers have identified sediment layers consistent with a massive wave event dated to roughly the period of the eruption. Sand and shells and sea creatures deposited meters above the normal shoreline. The fingerprints of water moving at speeds and volumes that have no natural explanation except one. Now, it's worth being careful here because the relationship between the eruption and the eventual collapse of Minoan civilization is not a simple straight line, and any honest account of it has to sit with that uncertainty. The dating has been genuinely contentious for decades. Some researchers place the eruption as early as 1628 BCE, based on tree ring evidence and ice core dating. Others prefer dates closer to 1500 BCE, based on archaeological stratigraphy. The gap between those two positions matters enormously because if the eruption and the collapse of the major Minoan palaces are separated by a century or more, then the volcano can't be the single killing blow. It becomes something more complicated, a wound that weakened a system that was already under pressure from other directions. But even the researchers who are most cautious about direct causation agree on one thing. Whatever the eruption did to the Minoan world, it wasn't nothing. Imagine being on the northern coast of Crete when that wave arrived. The Minoans had harbors there, trading posts, coastal settlements built by people who understood the sea, who had spent generations reading its moods and rhythms. The sea was their economy, it was their highway, it was probably in some sense their identity. And then one day, with no warning that any human observer could have recognized in time, the sea pulled back. Fish stranded on suddenly exposed seafloor, the water retreating far out, farther than any tide, farther, snorts, than anything anyone had seen. And then the horizon changed. That moment right there is where everything began to shift. The wave would have come in not as a wall, the way movies like to show it, but as a rising racing line of water that simply refused to stop. Boats smashed against quays and then carried inland. Warehouses, workshops, homes, all the fragile wooden parts of a harbor town picked up and hurled backward into streets clogged with debris and people. We don't have eyewitness accounts. We just have physics and the quiet testimony of sediment layers. But on a coast built around trade, around ships and storage, and the carefully balanced movement of goods, a tsunami isn't just a natural disaster. It's an economic amputation. You lose ships, not one or two, but fleets. You lose the sailors who knew the routes, the pilots who could read every reef and current by instinct. You lose stores of grain, amphoe of oil, copper ingots stacked and waiting for transport. You lose the physical infrastructure that makes long-distance exchange possible. The piers, the ramps, the carefully organized storerooms where scribes kept track of who owed what to whom. And while the sea can recarve a shoreline in a day, rebuilding a maritime network takes generations. Even if the main palaces on Crete weren't physically obliterated by the eruption itself, the entire operating system they depended on would have been shaken. Minoan power seems to have run through those palatial centers through their ability to collect goods from the countryside, concentrate them, and send them out again in exchange for metals and prestige items. The palaces were not just big houses. They were hubs of redistribution, bookkeeping, ritual, and international diplomacy. Cut the sea lanes even partially, and the flow of copper and tin slows, then stutters, then fails. Bronze production drops, artisans lose work, elites lose status goods. The delicate web of obligations and expectations that holds a complex society together starts to fray. At the same time, the psychological shock would have been immense. If your religion, your myths, your sense of cosmic order are tied to a benevolent sea and a predictable natural world, what does it do to you to watch that world suddenly turn murderous? How do you interpret a horizon that explodes, a sun that vanishes behind ash, rain that comes down, muddy and strange? Some scholars think the eruption might echo faintly in later Greek myths, stories of a lost island swallowed by the sea, of angry gods punishing arrogant kings. Others are more cautious, pointing out how easily we project our own desire for neat connections onto fragmentary evidence. But it's at least plausible that the cultural memory of something like this lasted in warped and retold form for centuries. Meanwhile, outside Crete, the rest of the eastern Mediterranean was watching. The Minoans had been the great sea people of their age, their ships showing up on Egyptian wall paintings, their pottery turning up in Levantine ports. When a dominant maritime power suddenly stumbles, the vacuum doesn't stay empty. Rivals notice neighbors who had been kept at arm's length by Minoan influence start to test boundaries. In the generation or two after the eruption, we begin to see something new in the archaeological record, increasing signs of Macedonian Greek presence in places that had been solidly Minoan. Macedonian-style weapons, pottery, and burial practices appear on Crete. Eventually, linear B tablets, the Greek writing system used by palace bureaucrats on the mainland, show up in former Minoan centers. Did the Macedonians invade in a single dramatic campaign, storming weakened cities and planting their banners? Or was it slower, more ambiguous? A creeping takeover through trade, intermarriage, mercenary service, and finally outright control once local elites had been hollowed out by disaster and debt. The evidence can be read both ways, and historians argue about the details, but the overall pattern suggests that whatever the eruption did, it left Crete vulnerable in a region where vulnerability was never left unexploited for long. There are signs, too, that the Minoans tried to get back on their feet. Some palaces show rebuilding phases after the likely date of the eruption. New walls go up, storage rooms are reorganized, religious spaces seem to remain active. This doesn't look like a civilization that instantly disappears. It looks like one that staggers, regroups, and then gets hit again, this time by human hands. Because political instability is contagious, trade disruption doesn't just mean fewer pretty imported goods. It means local rulers struggling to pay retainers, soldiers, and scribes. It means famine in bad years when foreign grain can't be brought in to cover the gap. It means formerly loyal subjects wondering if maybe the king across the water, the one whose ships still seem to arrive on time, has more to offer. In that fragile context, the arrival of heavily armed, already militarized mainland powers was not a minor event. Macedonian society, unlike the seemingly more peaceful Minoan system, was steeped in warrior ideology. Their palaces were fortified, their art glorified chariots and combat. When they inserted themselves into a weakened Crete, they didn't just bring new trade ties, they brought a different way of organizing power. Over time, the distinctively Minoan features begin to thin out. The art style shifts. Administrative practices change. The language encoded in the tablets changes. The palaces, once unmistakably Cretan in character, become something else, and then, eventually, many of them burn. By the later Bronze Age, Minoan civilization as an independent sea-dominating culture has vanished. Its influence survives in absorbed techniques, borrowed gods, and architectural ideas. But the thing itself, The carefree dolphins, the sprawling unfortified palaces, the invisible navy that once tied the Aegean together, is gone. And all we have left are the traces. A ring of islands around a flooded caldera, thin ash layers in distant soils, shards of painted pottery scattered across the sea floor where a harbor used to be. If you like drifting off to these kinds of lost worlds, there's a book that goes deeper into stories like this. Available at Sleep Eye Time History. Come with a discount this week for listeners. But for now, let the Minoans fade back into the waves, their ships dissolving into darkness. Because Cree was not the only place where nature and history teamed up to erase something extraordinary. Far away on the dusty plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, another great experiment in civilization was learning how fragile success could be when the climate itself turned against you. 2. Akkad's fall during the 4.22 kiloyear megadrought. By the time the Minoan ships were cutting white wakes across the Iron, the world's first real empire had already risen and fallen on those Mesopotamian plains. Akkad, the name, feels half mythical now, blurred together with later stories about Nimrod and Babel. But in the late 3rd millennium, BCE, it was something very concrete, a network of cities, canals, and garrisoned outposts stretching from the Persian Gulf up into the mountains of the north. Kings boasted in uniform that they were kings of the 4 quarters, rulers of everything the sun could see. And then very quickly, in historical terms, the boasting stops. The tablets thin out, the royal inscriptions falter. Later scribes talk about Akkad not as a living power, but as a ruined place, cursed and abandoned. Its bricks scattered, its granaries empty. For a long time this collapse was treated mainly as a political mystery. Court intrigue, invading tribes, angry gods, the kinds of explanations people reach for when they don't yet know to look at the sky, or the ice, or the mud at the bottom of a lake. Then, in the 20th and 21st centuries, geologists and paleoclimatologists started quietly reading a different archive. Not tablets, but cores. You take a steel tube and drive it down into the bed of a lake in Syria, or a marsh near the Euphrates, or the silty bottom of the Persian Gulf. You pull it back up, and inside is a column of mud and sand and microscopic fossils layered like a stack of pages. Each thin band is a year or a season, or sometimes a single violent event. Dark, organic, rich layers from wet times, pale, dusty layers from dry ones. When researchers began lining up those layers with radiocarbon dates and bits of buried plant material, a pattern emerged. Around 4,200 years ago, about 2200 BCE, something shifted across the Near East. Lakes that had quietly accumulated thick, dark mud for centuries suddenly switched to pale, fine grain dust. River flood plains show bands of wind-blown silt where seasonal floods used to leave heavier sediments. In caves, stalagmites record a sharp drop in rainfall etched in the chemistry of dripping water. It doesn't look like a single bad year. It looks like decades. In northern Mesopotamia, cores from dry lake beds and ancient marshes show repeated layers of lows, wind-blown dust piled up in the same window of time that Ardean kings stopped carving victory stelas. Farther west at sites in Syria and the Levant, you see abandoned irrigation channels overlain by the same faint powdery deposits. Farmers walked away. The wind kept working even offshore. The signal shows up in the Persian Gulf. Cores taken from the seafloor contained spikes of very fine, light-colored particles blown out from the land when vegetation thinned and soils were exposed. At the same time, tiny shell fossils shift towards species that prefer saltier, more stagnant water, suggesting that river flow into the Gulf had weakened. Less rain inland, less fresh water reaching the sea. It's as if the whole hydrological system of the region sagged. One way scientists cross-check this is by looking at things that don't care about human drama at all. Microscopic plankton, the mineral balance in cave formations, traces of pollen from long-dead plants. Around 2,000 years ago, pollen from water-loving species declines. Grasses, shrubs, and desert plants become more common in the record. In Oman and Iran, cave stalagmites show chemical signatures consistent with a major weakening of the Indian Ocean monsoon. Put together, the proxies tell a converging story. Rainfall patterns that had made dry farming and large-scale irrigation barely possible in northern and central Mesopotamia slipped and then stayed slipped for a painfully long time, not everywhere equally. Climate doesn't just turn off like a switch. Some river valleys might have kept a ghost of their old floods. Some years might have brought teasingly decent harvests, but on average over multiple decades, the water budget across Akkad's heartland shrank. Imagine being a farmer outside an Akkadian provincial city in that world. You're used to variability. The Tigris and Euphrates were never as predictable as the Nile. You've seen lean years, anxious harvests, priests muttering extra prayers. But this feels different. The spring floods are consistently lower. Canals you grew up knowing as broad murmuring channels become shallow trenches choked with reeds and mud. You adjust your planting dates, you dig your fields deeper. You leave more landau in the hope that what you do plant will have enough moisture. But each year the grain comes in a little shorter. Each year the granaries echo a bit more inside the cities. Scribes are still doing their job. They track rations, shipments, taxes paid in barley and wool. Clay tablets from the late Adian period begin to show something subtle but telling. More emergency grain deliveries to some regions, more references to bad harvests, more legal fights over water rights. Those tablets are the human side of the same story the lake cores are telling in mud. We can't say with absolute confidence that there was a single neat 4-2 kiloyear megad that slammed down uniformly from Egypt to Iran. The real picture looks patchy, complicated, with wetter pockets and drier pockets, and local factors twisting the pattern. But it does seem that right when the Akkadian Empire was trying to hold together an unprecedented span of territory, the climate backdrop shifted toward aridity in many of the zones it depended on most. And complex systems that are already stretched don't need a huge push to start coming apart. The first cracks don't show up as dramatic palace fires or invading hordes. They show up in the countryside, on the margins, in places where rainfall is just barely enough in a good year. They show up as dust on the wind, as fields left unplanted, as well that don't quite refill over the winter. From there, the pressure moves inward, toward the cities, toward the court, toward the carefully stacked hierarchy that made an empire possible. What that pressure did to AED's social fabric, how drought translated into famine, migration, and a slow unraveling of imperial power, is its own story. And it begins with those thin, pale layers of dust. That dust doesn't just lie there quietly in the story. It gets into people's lungs, their food, their politics. The simplest and harshest translation of a long dry spell is hunger. In temple and palace archives, ration lists start to shift. Where earlier tablets speak confidently of standard issues of barley to workers and soldiers, later ones begin to feature make-do substitutions, shortfalls, special deliveries because of scarcity. You can almost hear the anxiety between the lines. Famine in a pre-modern agrarian empire is never evenly distributed. The royal center tries to keep itself fed longest. Grain is pulled in from the provinces. Taxes are demanded in full, even when fields are patchy and canals are choked with silt. That means the hurt bites hardest on the edge first. For villagers on those marginal lands in northern Mesopotamia and along the empire's western frontier, there comes a year when the calculus changes. You can stay and hope that next spring is better, or you can walk. Archaeologists find that decision in the ground. Settlements in the rain-fed north or abandoned in this period. The fine dust layers that mark drought are followed by gaps in occupation, houses left to erode, fields reverting to scrub. At the same time in southern Mesopotamia, tablets begin to mention something new with almost obsessive regularity: Amorites. To later Mesopotamian scribes, Amorite becomes almost a stereotype, a shorthand for Western mobile, troublesome people. But if you step back from the rhetoric, they look a lot like drought refugees, pastoralists and semi-edentary groups from the drier fringes pushing season by season into the better-watered river valleys as their own pastures fail. Imagine standing on the walls of an Akkadian garrison town, looking out at camps that have sprung up along the canals, families with battered flocks, carts loaded with whatever they could carry, asking to graze, to draw water, to trade. To the local governor, they're both an opportunity and a threat. Extra hands if managed well, extra mouths if they can't be fed. The empire tries to manage it. Edicts regulate movement, assign grazing rights, record deportations, and forced resettlements. Some groups are settled as dependent communities tasked with military service. Others are pushed back or penned in, but tight control requires spare capacity, and drought quietly eats capacity from the bottom up. As crops fail more often, provincial governors skim a little more from what's left to keep their own retainers loyal. Soldiers go unpaid. Local elites who once depended on the distant king for legitimacy begin to look inward to their own fortresses and their own kin. Loyalty becomes negotiable. We start to see signs of that loosening in the writing itself. Seal impressions that once carried the names of Adian royals give way in some regions to local officials stamping documents with their own titles. The imperial titles don't vanish overnight, but they share space with new, more regional claims to authority. Meanwhile, in the cities, the social contract is fraying. Urban life in Mesopotamia was always a balancing act between temple, palace, and commoners. Temples collected grain, redistributed rations, and sponsored irrigation works. Palaces organized labor and war. Ordinary people planted, dug, hauled, and hoped the gods and the king kept the water flowing. In prolonged scarcity, that balance warps. When granaries run low, temples can't hand out the usual rations to dependent and hired workers. When canals silt up and there's no surplus labor to dredge them, irrigation networks become patchy, further reducing yields. People lower in the hierarchy begin to slip the net. Some sell land to pay off debts, creating larger estates in fewer hands. Others simply leave, slipping away from the city's orbit to join itinerant bands, caravans, or those same Amorite camps on the outskirts. Every departure is a tiny loss of taxable, conscriptable, controllable population. You can think of the empire as a great lattice of obligations and flows. Grain in, silver in, soldiers out, goods redistributed. Drought doesn't break every strut at once. It just removes a little from each junction until one day a storm, political or literal, hits and entire sections collapse. There are hints that as food grew scarce and migration increased, violence followed. Fortification walls at some northern sites are hastily repaired or thickened. Weaponry appears in layers dating to these final Akkadian decades more often than before. Later literary texts like The Curse of Akkad remember this time as one of brigands and chaos, when he who slept on the roof said, "Let me sleep in the house," and he who slept in the house said, "Let me sleep in the city square." Fear had become ambient. It's tempting to lay everything at the feet of climate, to say drought caused collapse and be done. But humans rarely move in straight, simple lines. Court struggles almost certainly played a part. Succession disputes, palace coups, breaks in the royal line after Naram-Sin and his successors. External enemies, Gutian mountain groups from the northeast, western migrants from the steppe, took advantage of weakness. What the drought seems to have done is tilt the board. In a world of fat harvests and full granaries, a usurper or invasion can be crushed with relative ease. In a world of short rations, nervous governors, and restless migrants, the same shock can cascade. Each province that slips away, each city that stops sending its quotota, makes it harder for the center to respond to the next crisis. By around 150–2100 BCE, the illusion of a unified Akkadian four quarters is gone. In its place, a patchwork in the south. City-states begin to reassert themselves under new dynasties. In the north and west, smaller polities and semi-nomadic groups carve out their own spheres. Akkad itself, the imperial capital, whose exact location we still haven't confidently found, fades from the record into legend. Later Mesopotamians look back on the Akkadian Empire as both a high point and a warning, a time when a single king dared to stretch his hand across all lands, and when the gods, angered or merely indifferent, Let dust and strangers and hunger unmake what he had built. For us tucked into bed thousands of years later, it's also a reminder of how thin the line can be between order and unraveling when climate leans the wrong way. Civilizations have risen and fallen many times since Akkad for many reasons, but the pattern of environmental stress translating into social strain, into famine, migration, political fragmentation shows up again and again in the stories we're exploring tonight. If you ever want to wander deeper into those patterns and into the quieter corners of ancient history, there's a book waiting for you at sleepytimehistory.com. And for this week, there's a discount tucked there, like a little clay tablet of good news in the archive. For now, though, let Akkad's dust settle back in your mind. One empire has crumbled under the weight of dry winds and human frailty. In the distance, beyond the curve of time, other river valleys are waiting, the Indus among them, ready to flourish and to face their own slow, unsettling shifts in water and weather. 3. The Indus Valley cities after river shifts and monsoon weakening follow that curve of time east. And a few centuries after Akkad's troubles, another river world is in full bloom. The Indus and its sisters. If you could drift above northwestern South Asia, around 2,200 and 2,000 billions CE, you'd see something very different from the steppe-rid plains of Mesopotamia. Here the landscape is braided with rivers and seasonal streams, floodplains and low mounds rising just enough above the waters to be safe. On some of those mounds sit cities so regular they look almost mathematical. Grided streets, brick platforms, wells set in neat rows. Names we use now, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, are modern conveniences. We don't actually know what their inhabitants called themselves or their cities. Their script, stamped into seals and etched on tiny tablets, still looks back at us unread, but the earth around and beneath those cities speaks a language we can follow a little better. It's the language of rivers. Unlike Mesopotamia's Tigris and Euphrates, the river systems that fed the Indus world were more complex. Some were glacial giants, like the Indus itself. Others were monsoon-fed seasonal torrents that came roaring out of the Himalayas and the Siwalik hills during the rains, then shrank or vanished for months. For a long time, archaeologists reading ancient Indian texts imagined one of those vanished rivers as almost mythical, the Saraswati, praised in hymns as mighty, wide, life-giving. 19th and early 20th century scholars sometimes treated it as legend, a poetic exaggeration. Then satellite imagery, field surveys, and sediment cores began lining up. Running through what is now the Gaga region across parts of modern India and Pakistan, researchers traced a broad, sinuous band of buried channels. Old riverbeds stacked and intertwined filled with sands that didn't match the local surface geology. Some of those sands, when analyzed, looked like they'd come from the Himalayas, carried down long ago by a big, energetic river. Along these dead channels sit some of the densest clusters of Harappan sites we know. Not just a city or two, but hundreds of settlements, villages, towns, possible regional centers strung like beads along a watercourse that is now dry. Core samples taken from these buried beds tell a story in layers. At the bottom, coarse, high-energy deposits, gravel and sand dropped by fast, voluminous water. Above that, finer silts and clays, suggestive of slower flows and calmer floods. Higher still, the signal of a shift. More wind-blown dust, soils forming in place, fewer clear flood deposits. The river had changed character and then effectively gone. Geologists call the way big rivers move from one course to another revulsion. It sounds gentle, but it can be anything but for the people depending on a particular branch. Think of a braided river on a floodplain building up its bed with silt year after year. Eventually the raised channel becomes unstable. One season, perhaps during an especially heavy monsoon, the river cuts a new path, shorter, steeper, more efficient from some bend in its course. Water that once faithfully flowed past a set of towns simply doesn't anymore. It finds a lower route. Old channels are left as ghost rivers, filling only in exceptional floods, then drying into sandy scars. In the Indus basin, the picture that's emerging is that some of the eastern Harappan heartland depended on just such a river system, fed more by monsoon rains and seasonal flows than by permanent glaciers. It seems to have been vulnerable to both evulsion and long-term weakening of the summer rains themselves. When scientists look at lake sediments and marine cores from the Arabian Sea for this period, they see hints of monsoon changes, pollen shifts, isotope ratios in shells, layers of dust and organic material that together suggest that after about 2,200 billions CE, the same broad window as the 4.22 kilo event that troubled Akkad South Asia's summer monsoon became less reliable, a little weaker on average, more prone to skips and swings in a system where some rivers are held up by ice and snowmelt that's survivable in channels largely propped up by seasonal downpours. It's more dangerous. You can stand today on the dry beds of the Gagahakra and imagine how that danger would have unfolded, not as a single apocalyptic day, but as an accumulation of odd years. A season when the flood came late, another when it came small, a decade where each generation quietly recalibrated what normal rains looked like, never quite realizing how far the baseline had shifted until fields stayed thirsty even in good years. At the same time, the bigger rivers to the west were not entirely stable either. Evidence from around sites like Mohenjo-Daro and from the wider Indus plain hints at channel shifts, overbank floods, and the slow lateral wanderings that great rivers are prone to when left to their own devices. Harappan people had clearly learned to live with some of that instability. They built on raised platforms, used standardized baked bricks that resisted water better than sun-dried mud, laid out drains to carry away excess. But all those defenses presupposed a certain pattern: dependable floods to replenish fields, manageable inundations that could be planned for, channeled, stepped back from. When the pattern itself began to change, when some rivers shrank, others wandered off, and the monsoon's pulse lost its old regularity, the whole urban choreography of the Indus world found itself dancing to a rhythm that no one had practiced for. In the layers of silt and sand around those empty channels, you can almost feel the tension building between water that still flowed somewhere and cities that had been built in confidence on a promise the rivers could no longer fully keep. At first, the cities tried to hold on. Archaeologists see phases of rebuilding in places like Mohenjo-Daro, walls patched, streets resurfaced, wells cleaned out and extended deeper. But over time, something changes in the pattern of debris left behind. Fine urban trash, broken ceilings, standardized weights, luxury craft waste thins out. Coarser, more rural material creeps in around the edges. The careful civic maintenance that had kept drains clear and streets neat seems to lapse in places. Flood deposits cut through lower neighborhoods and are not always cleaned away with the same energy as before. It doesn't look like a conquest horizon or a city burned in a single rage of violence. It looks more like people slowly drifting out of a house they once thought they'd live in forever. As water became erratic and fields harder to keep productive right around the great mounds, families had options. This wasn't a world of one or two mega-cities surrounded by empty land. The Indus civilization was always a dense web of towns, small settlements, and farmsteads. So the response, as far as we can tell, wasn't to cling desperately to the biggest cities until the bitter end. It was to loosen the urban knot. Over a few centuries after about 1900 BCE, population seems to thin at the great centers and thicken in the countryside. New sites appear away from the old river courses, sometimes in areas that had been more sparsely used before. Existing villages grow. The overall number of settlements in some regions actually increases, even as the classic big cities fade. On the ground, that shift shows up in very tangible ways. The famous baked bricks, produced to a consistent ratio that turns up again and again across the Harappan realm, become less common. In many later sites, people go back to using more perishable mud bricks or mixed techniques. The strict standardization that once linked distant builders into a single architectural conversation weakens. The script which once appeared on thousands of seals and tablets becomes rare. In many of the so-called late Harappan villages, you find almost no inscribed objects at all. If there was still writing, it wasn't being stamped into durable stone and fired clay with the same enthusiasm. Weight systems too fragment. Earlier cubical stone weights line up neatly into binary progressions, the same standards popping up over hundreds of kilom. Later, local variations multiply. It's as if the old agreements about what counted as a fair measure slowly dissolved into regional habits. Pottery tells a similar story. Classic Indus wares, carefully made with certain shapes and decorations that repeat from Punjab to Gujarat, gradually give way to more local styles. In some areas you see new painted motifs, different firing techniques, different vessel forms. The shared aesthetic that once stitched the Indus world together frays into a patchwork. But this isn't a story of cultural lights going out overnight. It's a story of traditions bending, thinning, and seeping into new forms. Agriculturally, there are hints of adaptation rather than simple failure. In some regions, people shift their emphasis toward crops better suited to drier, more variable conditions. Millets, for instance, alongside or instead of thirsty river-fed staples. Patterns of animal bones suggest hearing practices changed with more mobility, more flexibility. From a distance, it looks like a great civilization vanishing. Up close, it looks like city people becoming village people again. If you walked through one of those later settlements, you might still recognize echoes of the old urban world. A bead made with techniques perfected in the heyday of Harappan craft. A reused brick bearing the faint ghost of a mason's mark. A drainage channel or well layout that feels like a modest cousin of the grand systems in Mohenjo-daro. Memory lingers longest in small habits, and yet by around 1,300 to 200 billions CEE. Many of the classic Harappan traits are gone or transformed beyond easy recognition. The great mounds are no longer active scripted seals or heirlooms, if they exist at all. And newcomers, pastoral and agricultural groups with different ceramics and burial customs are filtering into parts of the old Indus zone. Whether those newcomers were descendants of the Harappans who had adopted new ways, or strangers folding into an already transformed landscape is still debated. The archaeological record has a way of blurring those human distinctions from the viewpoint of someone living through it. The change might not have felt like a collapse in the dramatic sense. Your grandparents might tell stories of a bigger town upriver where their own grandparents once lived. They might speak of brick streets and busy markets as something half legendary. But your world, the village, the fields, the seasonal gamble of the monsoon, would feel solid and immediate. Civilization in that sense didn't die. It decentralized. Knowledge traveled down into smaller, more flexible social units that could ride out uncertain rains and shifting channels with less risk of total failure. Instead of one big bet on a few giant cities, the Indus world scattered its bets across hundreds of villages. If you enjoy drifting through these quieter, slower stories of how societies bend instead of simply breaking, there's a book that goes deeper into this kind of long, gentle unraveling. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. And, for this week, there's a discount for listeners who want something to read or listen to after the episode ends. By the time later iron-using states and early texts begin to appear in northern India, the people who built Harappa and Mohenjo-daro are long gone as a distinct urban culture. But their choices, their turn toward flexibility, their scattering into the countryside may have helped seed the resilience of the societies that followed.
The rivers moved. The monsoon hesitated.
The cities, so carefully planned for a different rhythm of water, could not quite keep up. But the people did in their own quiet way. They stepped down from the brick platforms, walked out into the wider floodplains, and rooted their lives where the remaining streams still whispered through the dust. 4. The Late Bronze Age collapse. Eastern Mediterranean, around 1200 BCE. We're going to jump now from the Indus plains to a very different kind of web. not quiet villages and flexible fields, but a glittering ring of palaces around an almost enclosed sea. For centuries before 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean was one of the most interconnected regions on Earth. Egypt in the south, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Mycenaean palaces in Greece, the kingdoms of Syria and Canaan strung along the coast like beads, Cyprus in the middle, turning out copper for bronze. This was a world that ran on letters, caravans, and ships. Kings addressed each other as brother on clay tablets, traded princesses as diplomatic glue, and sent gifts back and forth that read like wish lists from a royal catalogue. Lapis from Afghanistan, tin from somewhere beyond the horizon, gold from Nubia fine oil, and wine from the Ayan. A bad harvest in one place could be eased by grain from Egypt. A rebellion in one city could bring troops from its allies. From a distance, it looks almost modern in its density of connections. Palaces full of scribes and storehouses, standardized weights, ration tablets, meticulously managed archives, a system that in its own way believed in its own stability. Then in the span of a few generations, the light along that whole ring dims on the ground. The story doesn't begin with heroic battles or famous last stands. It begins with layers of ash. At city after city, archaeologists hit a horizon where everything changes. Underneath orderly streets, administrative buildings, storage jars stacked in neat rows, tablets baked hard by the occasional accidental fire and left for us to read. Above charcoal collapsed walls, smashed pottery, and then less. In parts of Greece, the great Minoan palaces, Pios, Tyrans, Menae, end in fierce localized infernos. Rooms that once held labeled jars of oil and perfumed unwants are found with their contents fused and blackened. Roof beams crash down and seal the last moments of use in a frozen, burnt snapshot. After the fires, there's no clear rebuilding at the same scale. Sometimes a squatter's hut cuts into the ruins. Sometimes nothing at all for centuries along the Levantine coast at places like Ugarit in modern Syria. The destruction is almost eerily timed. In the final archive rooms, scribes were still pressing ununiform wedges into wet clay as the danger closed in. One letter found unbaked and fire hardened only by the city's end cries out for help. Enemies at the gates, ships cited urgent pleas to allies that, as far as we can tell, never arrived in time. The burn layer in Ugarit lies thick and unmistakable. Buildings collapsed while still full. Kilns and workshops were abandoned mid-task. The flames licked high enough to fuse pottery and bake bricks. A heat that speaks of deliberate destruction, not just an accidental kitchen fire gone wrong. Further inland, in the old Hittite heartland of Anatolia, the imperial capital Hattusa shows a similar pattern. Monumental gates, once crowned with lion carvings and sphinxes, end under toppled stones and traces of intense burning. After that horizon, the script that recorded Hittite laws and treaties vanishes. The empire that had negotiated as an equal with Egypt is suddenly silent. This isn't just a few unlucky cities catching fire. Across the region, layers dating to the decades around 1200 BCE carry signs of disruption. In some places, it's catastrophic burning. In others, it's abandonment without obvious violence. Storerooms left with goods in place, as if people walked away and never came back. And threaded through this archaeological debris are the voices of the people who were still writing during the early stages of the crisis. Egyptian inscriptions talk about years when no one sailed from certain ports, when previously reliable neighbors could no longer be counted on for tribute or trade. They describe peoples from the sea and northerners in their isles whose movements send ripples of panic along the coasts. Whether those groups were the main cause or just one symptom of wider turmoil, the texts are clear on one point. The old order was cracking. Other documents mention famine and grain shortages. A Hittite king writes hungry letters to the king of Egypt, begging for grain shipments to keep his land from starving. In another tablet, a local governor complains that the roads are no longer safe, caravans disrupted, old routes threatened by banditry or worse. When the texts thin out and finally stop, The burn layers keep going a little longer like echoes. Palaces, those dense knots where bureaucracy, religion, and wealth all met, seem especially vulnerable. Their very strengths in good times, centralized storage, dependence on long-distance trade, a class of specialists who didn't grow their own food, turn into weaknesses when the surrounding web frays. In some locations, we see hurried attempts to brace against the storm, walls thickened, gates reinforced, new fortifications rising on earlier foundations. But the destruction horizons cut across those efforts as if the storm simply blew past whatever last-minute defenses people could muster. Walking up through these layers in a trench, you can almost feel the tempo shift below. Centuries of relatively steady accumulation. Repair, rebuild, replaster, live. Above a jagged, broken record, ash, collapse, empty. What's missing in many cases is the clear next chapter. After the fires, there isn't always a new palace, a new archive, a new king's list picking up the thread. Sometimes there's just a simple village centuries later with a very different material world. Sometimes there's nothing until iron-using peoples with new languages and customs appear on the scene. The Late Bronze Age wasn't one city slowly emptying into its countryside. It was an entire network hitting some kind of breaking point, almost all at once. How that network failed, and what exactly was hammering at its weakest joints, is a story written in drought-stressed tree rings, shipwrecked cargoes, and those shadowy references to raiders and rebels. When people first tried to explain that breaking point, they often reached for a simple answer. Those pebbles from the sea in the Egyptian inscriptions were an obvious candidate. We group them now under the label Sea Peoples as if they were one coherent nation. But the texts themselves list a jumble of names, some possibly local, some perhaps from much farther away. They appear in reliefs as bearded warriors with feathered headdresses and ox-drawn carts, families on the move as well as fighters. In Egypt's own version of events, they're almost a force of nature. Whole confederations of migrants and raiders sweeping down the coasts in ships and on land, toppling cities, crashing borders. It's tempting to imagine them as the main culprit, a single marauding wave that smashed the palace world beyond repair. But when you look closer, the story blurs. Some of the groups listed may have been displaced locals, refugees from earlier disruptions. At least one people who appear as enemies in Egyptian texts later show up, settled as mercenaries and colonists under Egyptian oversight. The line between invader and resettled survivor isn't clean. And crucially, the destruction layers we see on land don't line up neatly with a single campaign. They sprawl across decades, even a century. Whatever the Sea Peoples were, they looked less like a lone hammer blow and more like one part of a longer storm. So researchers started asking what might have set that storm in motion. One candidate lies under ancient lake beds and in the narrow rings of long dead-ad trees climate. Around the time the palace world was faltering, evidence from cores, sediments, and pollen suggests a period of drier conditions across parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. In some regions, the shift appears subtle. In others, it looks like sustained drought. A few bad harvests in a village economy can be tragic, but survivable. In a hyper-connected Bronze Age system, where your palace depends on imported grain, on laborers fed from central storerooms, on armies and artisans whose hands never touch a plow, a run of poor years can cascade. Letters begging for grain from Egypt suddenly read differently. When you imagine the fields behind them turning to dust, rivers shrinking, herds thinned, banditry on caravan routes begins to look like desperate people intercepting food. Sea raiders become, at least in part, hungry coastal populations turning to piracy when normal channels fail. Drought alone doesn't burn a palace. But in a world already stretched tight by complexity, it frays the ropes holding everything together. That brings us to another thread: revolt from within. Those glittering centers ran on hierarchy at the top, kings and their close kin beneath them, layers of officials, scribes, priests, and soldiers. Below them still farmers, laborers, enslaved people, and captives from earlier wars. In prosperous years, the burdens of tax and corv labor might be tolerated, even ritualized. In lean years, the same demands could feel unbearable. In some burned cities, There are hints that not every fire came from an outside enemy. Ruins where the palace is destroyed but the lower town is not. Or where elite buildings are singled out while ordinary houses show less damage, have led some archaeologists to wonder about internal uprisings. People turning on their own rulers when promises of protection and plenty collapsed. We can't hear the voices of those at the bottom of the pyramid, but it isn't hard to imagine anger building in cramped quarters in fields that no longer yield in workshops still asked to produce goods for export while families go hungry. Now layer all of this together. Raiders by sea and land, shifting climate, unrest from below. At some point the discussion shifts from what single thing caused this to, how did all these stresses interact? That's where the idea of systems collapse comes in. The late Bronze Age networks were masterpieces of interdependence. Copper from here, tin from there, timber from that mountain range, grain from that floodplain, all channeled through nodes, palaces, port cities, fortified capitals that coordinated production and redistribution. The very efficiency of this setup made it brittle. If tin shipments faltered, bronze production stalled. If grain imports dipped, food rations to soldiers and workers shrank. If pay and supplies failed, loyalty wavered. A setback in one region could ripple outward, amplified at each step. You can imagine it like a series of tightly stretched cords, each tied to others. Snip one, and the tension on the remaining lines increases. Snip a few more, and the whole web starts to twist, pulling knots apart. In that kind of environment, the sea peoples might not be the original cause so much as an opportunistic symptom. Groups on the move because their own structures failed, further destabilizing neighbors as they searched for new lands. Drought doesn't just wither crops, it drives migration. Elite mismanagement doesn't just anger subjects, it leaves cities less able to respond to external threats. Every weakness feeds into the next. No single inscription announces the system has collapsed. It just stops. The last tablet enters the archive. The last scribe rolls up his reed stylus. Beyond that point, silence and a different kind of archaeology. Simpler houses, fewer luxury imports, tools made from iron instead of carefully alloyed bronze. Even in the quiet of night, the echoes of that tangled failure are still with us. When complex networks bind many regions together, they can raise living standards, spread ideas, cushion local shocks. They can also, under the wrong kind of strain, carry failure along the same routes that once carried wealth. If you'd like to wander deeper into stories like this, there's a book waiting at Sleepytime History. Come with a discount this week. You can tuck back into these vanished worlds whenever you like. But for now, as the Bronze Age palaces fall silent and the old scripts fade, we'll follow the people who walked away from them and see how in other times and other places humans again built fragile wonders on uncertain ground. 5. The ancestral pueblo and abandonment of Mesa Verde, far from the fallen palaces of the eastern Mediterranean, on a high plateau in what is now southwestern Colorado. Another experiment in complexity was unfolding and beginning to fray. Here the drama is written not in crumbling clay archives, but in stone tucked under overhanging cliffs in ash stains from long cold hearths and in the slow, patient growth of trees. Mesa Verde looks at first glance like an unlikely place for a flourishing society. It's a land of canyons and mesas, pinon and juniper-thin soils and fickle water. But for centuries, ancestral Puebloan communities turned that harshness into home. Before the famous cliff dwellings, most people lived on the mesa tops in pit houses and then in above-ground villages close to their fields of maize beans and squash. Rain and snowmelt seeped into the sandstone, emerging as springs and seeps along canyon walls. With careful timing and deep local knowledge, those scattered water sources could be enough. Over generations, farmers learned the moods of the land, where frost settled late, which slopes held moisture longest, how to plant dry farmed corn in widely spaced hills so that when rain did come, each plant had a fighting chance. By the 1200s, the communities around Mesa Verde had become elaborate, multi-story masonry dwellings, quiras, Circular ceremonial rooms linked by social and ritual ties. Networks that stretch beyond any one canyon, trading pottery, stone, food, and stories across what we now call the Four Corners region. From a distance, it can look like a world frozen in stone, but when you listen closely to the trees, you hear something else. Stress building year by year. Dendrochronology, the science of reading tree rings, has turned out to be one of the most precise clocks for this story. In the high desert, where growth is tightly bound to water, each ring in a longive tree is like a dated record of moisture and drought. Archaeologists and dendrochronologists have sampled beams from ancient roofs, broken posts abandoned in place, even dead trees still standing on remote ridges. When they line up those ring patterns against master sequences built from living and ancient trees, a timeline emerges in almost uncanny detail. The 13th century in the northern southwest, especially the decades after about 1270, is marked by what those rings quietly record, narrow bands of growth year after year. This isn't a single failed rainy season. It's a sustained period of reduced precipitation, sometimes called the Great Drought in this region. In a humid climate, such a stretch would be troublesome. In a marginal high-elevation dryland system already pushed to support dense populations, it's perilous. Imagine relying on fields that depend almost entirely on what falls from the sky. No great river to divert, no glacial melt to tap, just the hope that the seasonal rains will come roughly when and where they're supposed to. Now picture those rains beginning to falter. Tree ring records suggest exactly that, not a clean, sharp absence, but a pattern of repeated disappointments. Some years harshly dry, others merely poor, with few generous seasons in between. Over a span of decades, the landscape itself would have changed. Springs that once ran reliably might have shrunk or vanished in late summer. Soils already thin could have lost what little moisture they held more quickly each year. The cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, spectacular as they are, may have been built in part as a response to these shifting conditions. Tucked into aloves, they offer shade and some protection from the elements, but they sit below the mesa tops where most of the fields lay. To live there was to commute to your food down ladders, and hand and toe holds up again with harvests on your back. That choice suggests not just architectural flair, but a social world confident enough to invest vast labor into stone. Even as water grew less predictable, people were still building big when the trees were already telling a quieter, drier story. As the 1200s wore on, the contrast between those monumental walls and the narrowing rings in roof beams becomes stark. Each new beam pulled from a living tree carried the record of its own childhood. The fat rings of wetter years when it was a sapling, then the tightening bands as the drought bit deeper. Those timbers were lifted into place above rooms where families slept, cooked, stored their grain. Overhead in the ceiling was a memory of better seasons and a warning that those seasons were fading. The people at Mesa Verde didn't have satellite maps or climate models. What they had were eyes on the land, springs that failed earlier than their elders remembered, corn that came in shorter, more fragile, less reliable. They had stories of earlier dry times and how communities had adapted, moved, or endured. For a while they seemed to have stretched every strategy they knew, intensifying use of the best soils, sharing resources through kin networks, drawing on stored surpluses when they could, watching the sky. But water stress in a place like this doesn't fall evenly. Some canyon systems would have held on a little longer. Some springs would have persisted while others flickered out. The result is an instant uniform catastrophe. It's a slow patchwork of worsening options. The tree rings don't tell us how arguments sounded in caviar meetings or what it felt like to realize that the fields your grandparents planted might not sustain your own grandchildren. They just show us that as the 13th century drew toward its end, the climate backdrop for every decision was tightening. By the late 1200s, the same beams that let dendrochronologists date buildings so precisely also reveal something else. Construction tails off. New rooms stop being added. Repairs seem fewer. The stone cities in the cliffs begin quietly to stop growing. The drought isn't the whole story of why Mesa Verde was finally left behind, but it is the rhythm ticking underneath. the long dry drumbeat that made every other problem harder to solve, every choice more loaded. And as those choices narrowed, people began to look beyond the familiar aloves and mesa tops, tracing older trails and opening new ones, searching for places where the tree rings might once again widen. Those trails weren't guesses in the dark. The people of Mesa Verde were part of a much wider cultural landscape. To the south and west were the great PBLLO of the Rio Grande Valley. To the south and east lay the plains and valleys that would later be home to communities at places like Aoma and Zuri. To the west stretched the broad San Juan Basin with its own patchwork of settlements, fields, and sacred places. Archaeology suggests that as the 1200s waned, Mesa Verde wasn't so much abandoned as folded into this broader web. If you follow the pottery, you start to see the pattern. Styles that had been common in the cliff dwellings turn up more and more often in sites to the south, then fade out in the north. Designs shift, clay recipes change, but for a while you can trace familiar hands working in unfamiliar locations. It is if families packed not just their tools and seeds, but their aesthetics, their habits, their ways of marking who they were. Architectural clues tell a similar story. The multi-room blocks and kveras of Mesa Verde don't just vanish. Echoes of their layout appear in villages farther downstream along the San Juan and into the Rio Grande region, blended with local traditions. Old forms reassembled in new combinations. Migration in this view wasn't a single exodus on a particular morning. It was a process that may have unfolded over years, even decades. Some households leaving early, following kin who had already established footholds elsewhere. Others holding on, trying one more planting, one more appeal to the spirits, before finally accepting that the springs and soils of their childhood homes could no longer be trusted. Imagine that decision. You stand in a plaza ringed by rooms your ancestors built, kivas, where you learned prayers and stories, cornfields that have fed your people for generations. Around you the rock still holds the warmth of the sun. Above you, the cliffs loom as they always have, but the harvests are thin. The snowpack melts too fast. The stories your elders tell about earlier dry times all end with movement. People going somewhere else, joining other communities, weaving their lineages together. And beyond your canyon, there are places already known, trails your traders have walked, rivers that even in hard years carry more dependable water, villages where distant cousins live, who send word that there is room, that fields still yield, that ceremonies continue. Archaeological traces hint at how these moves may have unfolded. Small sites appear briefly along route corridors, occupied for a few years and then left. Way stations perhaps, or trial settlements that didn't quite work out. Farther afield, some PBLOO grow rapidly in the late 1200s and early 1300s, their room counts swelling as newcomers arrive. Socially, this kind of reorganization would have been as complex as any irrigation system. New arrivals needed places in existing kin networks. Marriages had to be negotiated. Ritual responsibilities, who tended which kiva, who held which ceremonial roles, had to be redistributed. Old identities rooted in particular canyons and mesa tops had to be stretched to fit new landscapes. The evidence suggests that in many regions this weaving together succeeded. The large PBLO of the Rio Grande Valley, for instance, seemed to have drawn in people from multiple directions. North from Mesa Verde country, west from other highland settlements, perhaps east from smaller communities on the plains. The result was not a single refugee camp, but a reconfigured society, more densely clustered along perennial water. Underneath the mechanics of pots and room counts lies something softer: memory. When people move under pressure, they carry their places with them in story and ritual. Hills back home become songs, springs become prayers, cliff dwellings become ancestral houses in the mind, visited in dream and ceremony, even when the actual aloves fall silent. Some scholars think echoes of the Mesa Verde world survive today in the oral traditions of Pueblo peoples, who trace migrations from the north and west, who speak of journeys of stopping places of sacred landscapes left behind but not forgotten. These stories aren't simple historical records, and it would be misleading to map them one-to-one onto archaeological sites. But they do remind us that what looks from a distance like abandonment can from the inside feel like continuation, life flowing onward along new channels. Meanwhile, across that wider southwest, other centers were rising and falling in their own rhythms. Cho to the south had already boomed and ebbed. Smaller communities blinked on and off like desert stars. Mesa Verde's silence was just one part of a much larger rearrangement. In this sense, the people of the cliffs weren't erased. They were absorbed, transformed, and dispersed. Their beams left behind have become timelines for scientists. Their walls emptied have become museums of stone. But their descendants did what human groups under stress have done again and again. They moved, they joined others, they reinvented home. Somewhere in that movement is the same resilience written into so many of the stories in this series. Societies can contract, landscapes can harden, familiar places can be left to the swallows and the wind, but people find ways to keep going. If you've drifted this far, and you're still awake, and you're curious to go deeper into these quiet disasters and slow migrations, there's a book waiting for you at Sleepytime History.com with a discount running this week. It's there if you want it when the dreams let you go. For now, let the image of those empty cliff dwellings soften at the edges. Not tragic ruins, but echoes of a decision to walk away while walking towards something else. And beyond Mesa Verde, there were many other places where climate, water, and human ambition tangled in similarly fragile ways. Number 6 takes us far from the dry mesas of the southwest into a world of thick jungle, stone pyramids, and calendars carved in precise, patient lines. The classic Maya. For centuries, their cities rose out of the land forests of what is now Guatemala, Biz, Honduras, and southern Mexico. Temple pyramids layered like steps to the sky, palaces wrapped around courtyards. Still, tall stone monuments lined up in plazas, each one a frozen announcement in hieroglyphs, a king's birth, a victory, a ritual, a date. Those dates tick along steadily through the classic period. 600, 650, 700, 750 rulers ascend, wars are fought, alliances made and broken, ceremonies performed on schedule with the movements of the heavens. And then in city after city, the inscriptions falter, steles stop being raised, palace complexes are left half-finished, courts where the ball game echoed go quiet, the forest begins slowly and then more confidently to take the stone back. Archaeologists call this the terminal classic collapse. It wasn't a single night of destruction. In many places it was more like a long exhale. Different cities, fading at different times across the 700s, 800s, and early 900s of our era. For a long time, people argued about why was it war, revolution, trade routes shifting away. Some scholars leaned toward politics, others toward environment. The jungle doesn't give up its secrets easily. Stones topple, wood rots, texts are rare, and often broken. But beneath that green canopy something else was recording the story. Not in words, but in chemistry. Scattered through the Maya lowlands are lakes. Quiet round basins ringed with trees that have watched 1,000 rainy seasons come and go. Year after year, fallen leaves, dust, pollen, and microscopic shells drift down through their waters and settle on the bottom. Over centuries, those layers stack up like the pages of a book. In the 20th and 21st centuries, researchers began to take cores from those lake bottoms, long cylinders of mud and silt, each cm a little farther back in time. Under microscopes and in isotope labs, those dull gray cores lit up into narrative. One of the cleanest signals came from oxygen isotopes. Rainwater in the tropics carries a particular ratio of oxygen atoms, some slightly heavier, some slightly lighter. When rain is plentiful, lakes get a steady inflow and outflow, and that ratio stays within a certain band. When drought grips the land and evaporation dominates, the lighter atoms are preferentially lost to the air, leaving the water and the shells that form in it enriched in the heavier form. Those tiny shells settle into the mud and keep that ratio locked in place, time-stamped by depth. When scientists measured oxygen isotopes from lake sediments in the Maya region, places like Lake Chichinab and other basins scattered across the Yucatan, they found that the centuries bracketing the terminal classic weren't just dry in some vague anecdotal sense. They showed sharp spikes, periods when the water had been stripped again and again by heat and evaporation, evidence not of one bad year, but of repeated drought episodes, some lasting decades, with short, teasing recoveries in between. In some cores, the interval from about 800 to 950 CE looks like a heartbeat under stress, a flutter of alternating pulses, slightly wetter, then intensely dry, then worse. Still climate models and other proxies like cave formations or speleos that grow differently depending on rainfall tell a similar story. The great monsoon that usually soaks the region seems to have weakened, retreated, stuttered. For the people living in those stone-ranged cities, this wasn't an abstract shift on a graph. It was corn that didn't mature, reservoirs dropping then cracking in the heat, forest edges creeping inward as farmers pushed farther to find reliable soils, sacred cenotes, natural sinkholes that held precious water, becoming not just ritual centers but lifelines. The precision of their own calendar would have made the pattern painfully obvious. Gear wheels turning with fewer storms, fewer clouds, more days when the sun blazed bright and pitiless over fields that refused to green. And this wasn't a single drought sweeping the whole Maya world at exactly the same instant, like a switch being flipped. The isotope records suggest a mosaic. Some regions struck earlier, others later. Some hit harder, others less so. A patchwork of stress moving through space and time. This patchwork matters because when you place it alongside the archaeological record, the dates on the last monuments, the abandonment of particular plazas, the hurried modifications to water systems, you start to see an intricate overlap, rainfall weakening, lakes shrinking, stillate dates faltering. Under that slow meteorological pressure, the political and social fabric of the classic Maya world began to stretch thin and in places tear. How that strain turned into empty palaces, toppled kings, and shifting centers of power is another kind of story. One written not in water and isotopes, but in warfare, legitimacy, and the redirection of trade and tribute. If you zoom in on the last century or two of monument dates, the calm image of priest-kings harmonizing the heavens with their cities starts to flicker. Inscribed on those stale and carved stairways, the language of the courts changes tone. Victories over neighbors are proclaimed more often. Captured lords are paraded in glyphs and images, sometimes literally shown being humiliated or sacrificed. Titles multiply as kings emphasize their right to rule not just through ancestry and ritual, but through conquest. It's as if under growing environmental stress, legitimacy itself became a battlefield. In the classic Maya world, a ruler's authority rested on a delicate tripod: lineage, ritual performance, and success. You had to be descended from the right ancestors. You had to stage the correct ceremonies on the correct days. Bloodletting, feasting, incense rising at the moments when the calendar demanded it, and crucially, you had to keep the flow going. Tribute, captives, luxury goods, rain. When the skies failed, that last requirement became dangerous. Imagine standing at the top of a temple pyramid, overseeing a city that has expanded for generations, terraces carved into hillsides, households clustered thick around reservoirs, farmers pushing into marginal soils. Your astronomer priests have forecast the coming rains. The people have done their part. Offerings made, fasts kept, king's blood spilled. But the clouds drift by without breaking. The maize withers anyway. Do you admit the gods are displeased with you? That your rituals aren't working? Or do you insist that enemies are to blame? That rival kings are disrupting the cosmic order? That only through victory, sacrifice, and perhaps the seizure of more fertile lands can balance be restored? The inscriptions suggest many chose the second path. As some centers began to wobble under the weight of drought and internal strain, others tried to step into the vacuum. New alliances formed, old hegemonies fractured. Cities like Tikal and Kakmul, once the great poles of power, found their elaborate networks of subordinate towns and trading partners fraying. Warfare that had often been ritualized and bounded raids for prestige, captives for display, seems to have become more frequent, more desperate, and in places more destructive. Fortifications appear around some late sites. Settlements are moved to more defenseful locations. Burn layers and hastily abandoned compounds hint that not every palace went quiet peacefully. Underneath these clashes ran the quiet but transformational shift of trade. For centuries, the land capitals had sat astride important routes. Jade from distant quarries, obsidian blades from volcanic highlands, cacao beans, feathers, salt, textiles, all flowed along paths that stitched the rainforest city-states into a single economic fabric. Prestige goods bound vassals to overlords. Tribute shipments reinforced hierarchy. But if rivers became less reliable, if swamps expanded or shrank unpredictably, if banditry and border conflicts made certain roads dangerous, then caravans might simply choose different corridors. Archaeologists tracing obsidian sources and ceramic styles see patterns that match this story. Some inland centers find their access to key materials dwindling in the Terminal Classic. At the same time, sites in the Puke Hills of the northern Yucatan, and eventually along the drier but coastal connected north, show signs of rising prominence. Merchants are pragmatic. If a port city on the Gulf Coast offers safer passage and more stable leadership, if upland communities promise grain when land harvests fail, trade will bend toward them. Over decades, that bending can turn into a permanent rerouting. When the trade arteries move, the political heart that once pulsed at their center can weaken. In a world where power is performed in caca feasts and jade-laden ceremonies, a king whose storerooms thin out begins to look less like a divine intermediary and more like a man whose favor has faded. Subjects may listen more closely to local lords promising security, or to rival dynasties whose emissaries arrive with full baskets and bold words. Inscriptions from the late 8th and early 9th centuries hint at this unraveling. Some kings stop recording great victories and instead memorialize much smaller, more local events. Others vanish mid-sequence, their lines of dates truncated with no explanation. At certain sites, stela left blank as if the intention was there. The resources or stability were not. The fragmentation wasn't uniform. While some land cities emptied, others limped on, altered but not erased. In the highlands and along the coasts, Maya communities adapted, reoriented, persisted. The collapse was not the end of a people, but the end of a particular way of organizing power, water, and belief in the rainforest lands. Today, when you stand in those plazas, the jungle pressing close and the stale weathered almost smooth, it's easy to feel only the silence. But buried in broken glyphs and shifted trade patterns is a more complicated murmur of drought pushing kings to overreach, of wars fought to sustain fading legitimacy, of merchants and farmers voting with their feet. The classic Maya cities did not explode in a single cataclysm. They thinned, hardened, and in many places cracked under the combined strain of climate, conflict, and changing connections. Authority that had once seemed as solid as stone turned out to be as fragile as the seasonal rains. If this kind of slow, intricate unraveling fascinates you, there's a longer version of tonight's stories waiting in print form. Soft pages, more detail, the same gentle pacing. You can find it along with a discount that's running this week at Sleepy Time History. For now, let the image of those forest-hidden temples sink back into the dark. The kings are gone. The sky turns over them as steadily as ever, and far away in time and space, another civilization is about to face its own struggle with water power and the limits of what a single system can bear. Thankles decline after monsoon extremes and water system strain. On another continent, many centuries later, a different forest would wrap itself around the ruins of another water-hungry civilization. This one rose not in the rainforests of the Maya lowlands, but on the flat floodplains of mainland Southeast Asia, where the Mekong River fans out and the monsoon comes. In a good year, like a scheduled miracle, at its height, Angkor was a kind of hydraulic dream made real. Reservoirs the size of small lakes, canals traced in straight lines across the landscape with almost defiant confidence, dikes and embankments guiding water from where it fell to where rulers wanted it to be. For a long time, historians knew this mostly from inscriptions and from what could be seen with the naked eye. Temple complexes draped in strangler figs, causeways half sunken into rice fields, sandstone towers reflecting in still pools. It looked like a city of temples, a spiritual capital. Only recently did it become clear just how much more was hidden in the ground. When researchers began to fly over the Cambodian plain with LiDAR, laser scanners that can see through vegetation, they weren't sure exactly what they'd find. They expected some additional structures, maybe a few forgotten roads. What emerged instead was the ghost of an entire engineered ecosystem beneath the forest canopy and modern villages. The landscape lit up with a lattice work of straight lines, right angles, faint embankments, ditches that weren't quite natural, mounds that formed grids, channels that didn't follow the easy slope of the land but cut across it. The picture that formed was staggering. Angkor wasn't just a cluster of monumental temples surrounded by fields. It was a low-density city, spread over hundreds of square kilns stitched together by one of the most elaborate water control systems ever built before the industrial age. Canals ran east, west, and north-south, stepped like stairs to accommodate slight changes in elevation. Giant reservoirs. The Beret could store wet-season floods and release them slowly into the dry months. Smaller ponds and mows served neighborhoods, temples, and fields. From the air you can trace the outlines of this hydraulic web, as if you're looking at the veins of a leaf. Everything connected, everything in theory balanced. But LiDAR doesn't just show perfect geometry. It also reveals where that geometry failed. In some sectors, the neat lines of canals are interrupted by strange widening, as if their banks had slumped and been hastily rebuilt. Dikes appear doubled, overlaying one another at odd angles. Channels that once ran straight suddenly kink and divert, cutting new paths around something that went wrong. Those scars match stories written not in stone, but in mud. If you take cores from the bottoms of Angkor's old reservoirs and canals, long cylinders of sediment laid down year after year, you get another kind of archive. Layered bands of clay, silt, sand, charcoal, pollen. A quiet record of water flowing, fields plowed, forests cut, floods raging. In some cores, the lower levels are fine and orderly thin, regular layers of mud that suggest calm, controlled water moving slowly, dropping its load of silt in gentle pulses. Above them, though, the pattern changes abruptly. The sediment becomes coarse. Sand and even gravel appear where there should only be silt. The layers grow thicker and more chaotic, packed with fragments of eroded soil, shattered plant matter, and sudden spikes of charcoal. To the geologists reading these cores, it looks like the moment a carefully tended system began to be hit by something it was never designed for. Extremes. Periods of unusually intense monsoon rains, likely arriving in violent bursts, would have sent torrents rushing off the deforested hills around Angkor. Instead of filling the Beret slowly, that water roared through the canals, scouring their beds, undercutting their banks, dumping slugs of sediment into places that were meant to stay clear. The lead maps show where those torrents left their mark. Channels clogged and abandoned, new bypasses cut, embankments fortified and fortified again, as if engineers were racing to keep up with a river that had forgotten the rules. Then, stacked between those flood layers, the cores tell a different story. Intervals when the mud thins and dries, when pollen from aquatic plants drops away, when the chemistry of the sediment hints at stagnation and exposure to air. Signs not of too much water, but of too little. Drought, and then deluge, deluge, then drought again. Over decades, maybe over a century or more, this oscillation appears to have become more severe. A monsoon that had once been relatively predictable slipped into a phase of higher variability, the kind of climate whiplash we now have instruments to measure. But Angkor's engineers had only their experience to go on. They responded as best they could. The evidence of repairs and modifications shows a society trying to adapt, widening spillways, raising embankments, digging new feeder canals to route water from more distant sources, carving emergency channels to drain sudden floods. But the sediment doesn't lie about the strain. In reservoir after reservoir, the upper layers become dominated by coarse, rapidly dumped material. In some, the final phase is a thick, jumbled blanket of sand and silt, as if a last catastrophic flood surged through, erasing the careful contours at the bottom. By the time those layers were forming, the giant beret that had once glittered as mirrors of royal power might have been choking with sediment, their capacity shrinking just as the climate demanded more flexibility, not less. What it meant on the ground for farmers at the edge of this vast hydraulic web is harder to reconstruct. Their voices don't survive, but the damaged channels and clogged reservoirs suggest that the smooth delivery of water, the rhythm of planting and harvest that Anka's rulers claimed to guarantee, was beginning to stutter. In a city built on the promise that kings could command the monsoon, every broken embankment and silted-up canal was not just an engineering failure, it was a crack in the story that held the whole system together. And as those cracks spread through the waterways, something else was happening beyond the city's ponds and beret, along the natural rivers that flowed past Anka's edge. Those rivers had always been there, looping and braiding their way through the floodplain, rising and falling with the seasons on their own schedule. Not the kings. For centuries, Anka's rulers had tried to bend them into their designs, tying natural channels into the grid of canals, diverting flow, building bridges and embankments. The heart of royal power lay in land, anchored to the great temple mountains and the artificial lakes that mirrored their silhouettes. But as the monsoon grew more capricious, the balance between the engineered world and the untamed river shifted. When the canals clogged, the rivers still ran. In years of heavy rain, they might have been swollen and unpredictable, jumping their banks, gnawing at their own meanders. In years of drought, their flow slackened, but deep bends and shaded reaches still held water when some artificial channels stood as dry trenches. For traders and boatmen, the message was simple. If you wanted a route that worked most of the time, you followed the river, not the canal. Archaeologists can't interview those boatmen. They infer their choices from quieter clues. Ceramics that show up more and more often downriver at ports and riverine markets. Imported goods clustering along natural waterways rather than in the old urban core. Inscriptions that once named Angkor as the central stage of royal life now appearing in other places closer to the sea. As the hydraulic web around Angkor strained, the economic web began to reweave itself along easier lines. Imagine being a merchant in the late 13th or 14th century. Your livelihood depends on moving rice, forest products, metals, maybe even rare woods or ivory. You can trust the Royal Canal network, which has been repaired and re-repaired, its embankments patched, its reservoirs silt-choked, or you can load your cargo onto boats that ride the natural flow downstream toward growing river towns and coastal harbors. One route carries prestige, the other reliability. Over time, more and more people seem to have chosen reliability. The sea, too, was calling maritime trade across the Gulf of Thailand and into the wider Indian Ocean world was intensifying. Chinese, Malay, Indian, and later even Arab merchants were knitting together a floating economy of spices, textiles, ceramics, and metals. Ports that could plug themselves into that circuit had an advantage that no inland capital, however splendid, could easily match. Power in mainland Southeast Asia began to tilt toward those ports and the river mouths that fed them. Inscriptions and royal chronicles hint at this shift. Later, Khmer kings are associated more with regions downriver, nearer to what is now Phnom Penh and the confluence of major waterways. Political centers appear to have become more mobile, less fixated on the monumental core of Angkor, and more responsive to where trade and tribute were actually flowing. Angkor did not fall in a single night of fire. It seems to have thinned. Elite households, administrators, artisans whose skills tied them to temple projects and royal ceremony could move. If you were a scribe or an official and news came that the court was relocating closer to a thriving riverport, you would probably follow. Power, after all, is where decisions are made and gifts are given. Rural farmers around Angkor were less mobile, but even they had choices. If a particular segment of canal failed one too many times, if a reservoir no longer filled reliably, families could drift toward villages with better access to functioning waterways, whether artificial or natural. Over a couple of generations, the dense tapestry of occupation around the old temples could loosen without any dramatic evacuation. LIDAR, which first revealed the city's former vastness, also shows the traces of this soft retreat. Fewer signs of late occupation in some sectors, more activity in others, as if the life of the region was slowly pouring down gentle slopes toward the rivers and the sea. In the historical record, foreign visitors to Ankara notice something similar. Early accounts describe a bustling, glorious capital. Later ones, fewer in number, hint at a place already partly quiet, its ceremonial heart still beating, but no longer the unquestioned center of gravity. At some point the court's presence there becomes sporadic, then ceases. New capitals are named elsewhere. Ankar's temples remain, stone and laterite enduring, where wooden houses and palaces vanish. But the steady hum of administrative life, the flow of tribute and decree, has shifted downstream. In this sense, climate and water didn't just break Ankar's infrastructure. They nudged its rulers and its people onto different tracks, ones that favored alignment with natural rivers and maritime trade over the maintenance of an increasingly fragile hydraulic dream. Far from being wiped away in a single cataclysm, Ankara dissolved into the surrounding landscape and into successor states that reoriented themselves toward the currents of commerce and the tides. Its disappearance as a political capital was so gradual, so absorbed into the normal churn of dynastic change and regional rivalry, that when the forest finally closed over its abandoned reservoirs and quiet causeways, there was no single moment for anyone to mark. Centuries later, when explorers and archaeologists tried to reconstruct what had happened, they encountered not a clear story of conquest or fire, but hints and absences. Silt where water once stood, canals that led nowhere, inscriptions that stopped mentioning a place that had once seemed eternal. Some of those hints and the wider patterns of climate and collapse they reveal are woven into a book I've put together, which you can find at Sleepytime History. Come with a discount running this week if you're curious to wander deeper into these lost worlds. For now, Ankara drifts back into the dark, its towers and beret returning to stillness, and we follow the murmuring line of catastrophe and adaptation onward toward another edge of the map, where settlers pushed into colder seas and trusted a different climate more than it deserved. 8. The Greenland North settlements and the Little Ice Age. From humid jungles and monsooned reservoirs we shift to a place where water wears a different face. Ice-pack ice grinding along a rocky shore. Sea ice creeping a little farther out into the North Atlantic every decade. Snow that lingers on the ground just long enough to shave a few days off the growing season, and then a few more until what once felt like a marginal gamble turns into a slow-motion trap. When Norse settlers first reached Greenland around the end of the 10th century, it didn't look like a trap. They saw what they were trained to see: familiar signs of pastures and promise, south-facing slopes with thin soils and tough grasses, low sheltered fjords where you could beach a ship, pull it up beyond the tide line, and imagine unloading cattle from a pitching deck. They called the place Greenland, not because it was carpeted in fields, but because in the few warm centuries before the Little Ice Age, the coastal margins really could support a narrow strip of European-style life. Not easily, never easily, but just enough. Picture a scattered archipelago of farms, not so different from remote valleys in Iceland or Norway. Turf-walled houses half dug into the ground for warmth, cattle stalls and sheep pens clustered close hayfields on the flattest land, and beyond that the hard edge where pasture gave way to rock, glacier, and tundra. For a while this system worked. The settlers cut hay in summer, kept cattle, sheep, and goats through the winter, and planted small patches of barley where the soil and sun allowed. They tidied butter and cloth to their church, paid rents to far-off lords, and sent prized exports, walrus, ivory hides, maybe even live falcons back to Europe in exchange for iron, timber, and luxuries that Greenland itself could not provide. On the surface, it looked like a northern frontier of the same agrarian world that had shaped them. Then the cold began to creep in. The change was not a single brutal winter, but a long, irregular slide. Some years nothing much was different. Others brought heavier sea ice that lingered longer along the coast, rougher storms, shorter summers. Over generations the baseline shifted. For archaeologists, that shift isn't written in diaries. It appears in bones when they excavate the garbage heaps of Norse farms, the maidens where centuries of meals were thrown away. They can read diet like a timeline. Early layers are full of domestic animals, cattle bones, pig, sheep, goat. The food of people who believed that farmers, not hunters, defined a proper life. In later layers, the pattern tilts more seal bones, more fish, more seabirds, the signatures of the sea. On some sites, the proportion of marine food remains climbs steadily. What began as a farmstead with some hunting on the side turns bit by bit into something else. A community whose survival leans more heavily on the ocean and the ice edge than on fields and barns. It wasn't an overnight decision. You don't wake up after one cold summer and abandon your cattle, the animals that anchor your social status and your sense of who you are. Instead, you hedge. You send more men out in kayaks and small boats when the seals haul out on the ice in spring. You trade for dried fish with neighbors whose fjords are richer in cod. You start to salt and smoke more of what you catch, just in case next winter runs along. The garbage heap remembers these choices. Over decades, the ratio of cow to seal, sheep to fish shifts. At the same time, the bones themselves change. Cattle and sheep from later periods show signs of stress. Thinner animals more evidence of slaughter at younger ages, as if there simply wasn't enough fodder to keep a full herd alive through lean winters. Pollen trapped in peat and lake sediments adds another layer to the story. Early in the settlement, there are traces of imported grasses and disturbed soils, signals of hayfields and grazing. Later, those signals weaken, replaced by more hardy native species. Land that had been wrestled briefly into something like a European pasture seems to be slipping back toward a subarctic scrub. In this sense, the Norse in Greenland were living inside a narrowing corridor. On one side, the climate was eroding the foundations of their farming economy. Shorter growing seasons, more winter kill on the fields, more hay lost to untimely snow or rain. On the other, the sea was offering a partial lifeline. Seals clustered along the ice edges, fish streaming along rich coastal currents, migratory birds arriving like clockwork. The settlers walked that corridor as far as they could, step by step, meal by meal, adjusting without ever quite admitting that the adjustments were becoming permanent. From the outside, centuries later, we can see how deep the change cut. In the earliest phases, a Greenland Norse feast might have centered on beef, dairy, and bread, baked from imported or locally grown grain. In the latest phases, if the Maidens are any guide, a festive table would have leaned heavily on seal meat, fish stew, perhaps seabird eggs, with beef a rarer indulgence. Their world was tilting from field to fjord. But unlike the Inuit hunters they sometimes met, a people whose entire culture was tuned to the rhythms of sea ice, migration, and marine mammals, the Norse identity remained tied stubbornly to agriculture, to churches, to cattle in the byre, even as those pillars grew more fragile. As the Little Ice Age deepened, that tension between who they were and what the land and sea allowed them to be would become more than a matter of taste. It would shape their ability to adapt, to trade, to endure the decades when ships came less often and winters bit harder. The bones and the pollen tell us that their diet was already changing. What happened when the outside lifelines began to fray and isolation and cold closed in together belongs to the next turn of the story. Isolation crept in almost as quietly as the cold. For the first century or two, Greenland wasn't a dead end. Ships from Iceland and Norway came reasonably often in summer, bringing iron, timber, cloth, and news. Priests arrived. Bishops were appointed. A cathedral rose in the eastern settlement, complete with carved stone and imported glass. People from outside New Greenland existed. They wrote about its walrus ivory and its hardy farmers as curiosities at the edge of the known world. But edges have a way of fraying. As sea ice thickened and lingered longer in the North Atlantic, the crossing became more dangerous, more uncertain. Years passed when no ship made the journey at all. A handful of missed seasons can be dismissed as bad luck. A string of them spread over decades becomes something else. A subtle but steady tightening of the noose. From the Greenland side that would have felt like being slowly walled off. Iron tools dulled and broke, nails rusted, timber for shipbuilding, already scarce on that treeless coast, became harder to replace. The things they could not make for themselves, steel knives, new plowshares, luxury items, religious books became rarer, then precious. Then maybe just memories recited by old people who remembered when a ship's arrival turned the whole fjord into a festival. Walrus ivory. The export that had once underwritten their place in the northern economy also lost value. New sources closer to Europe were found. Taste and fashion shifted. The same tusks that had once paid for iron and fine cloth might now fetch less or nothing at all. Trade, the fragile thread that had tied Greenland's farms to a wider world, thinned. We don't know exactly when the last ship from Norway or Iceland sailed into those fjords. Medieval documents hint at irregular voyages. A bishop's visit here, a merchant's attempt there. Then the records go quiet. Silence in a ledger isn't the same thing as silence on the shore, but for archaeologists and historians, it feels close. Inside Greenland, that shrinking horizon must have forced hard questions. How long do you keep tithing to a church whose higher authorities no longer come? How long do you maintain the social fiction of being a far-flung province of a Christian kingdom across the sea when the kingdom has seemingly forgotten you? The physical remains suggest that people clung to that identity as long as they could. Churches were repaired. Graves were laid out in orderly Christian cemeteries. A bishop's seat stood at least for a while, even as the community that supported it dwindled. But the burials tell another story too. In the later phases, graveyards show fewer rich goods. Jewelry and ornaments grow simpler. Some skeletons show signs of nutritional stress, shorter stature, enamel defects on teeth from childhood hunger, evidence of illness. These are small clues, each one ambiguous on its own, but together they hint at a population living closer to the edge. Then quite suddenly, in archaeological terms, the trail seems to end. Farm buildings stand abandoned, roofs collapse and turf walls slump back into the soil. The last bones in the Maidens belong to people who were still eating seal and fish, still keeping some livestock, still inhabiting a world of fields and fjords that would have looked familiar, if harsher, to their great-grandparents. And then, nothing. No layer of burned material that would shout invasion or massacre. No mass graves that would clearly announce a catastrophic epidemic. No thick band of ash or silt that would mark some great natural disaster. Just the absence of later layers, the quiet of places no longer used. This is where the story of the Green and Norse slips from history into something closer to haunting. Scholars have proposed possibilities: gradual depopulation through hunger and disease, young people leaving for Iceland or Markland, Labrador or Newfoundland, on whatever ships remained, until too few were left to keep the old farms running. Conflict or gradual marginalization in contact zones with Inuit communities better adapted to the tightening cold. A final desperate winter or three when hay ran out early and cattle and then people fell in the snow. Each theory fits some pieces, but not all. Each opens as many questions as it closes. One possibility is that there was no single climactic ending at all, just a long, uneven fading. A farm here abandoned after a patriarch dies, and his heirs decide not to risk another season. Another lost when a storm destroys boats needed for seal hunting. A third that manages to hang on improbably long, only to be undone by some small final miscalculation. A late thaw, an early freeze, a ship that never appears on the horizon. For anyone who lived through those last decades, the experience wouldn't have been an abstract collapse. It would have been 1,000 practical decisions, each one rational in the moment. Slaughter another cow to get through this winter. Postpone fixing the boat until next year. Promise the children that the ship will come again, the way it used to, the way it must. From our distance, the Greenland Norse looked like a vanished branch of the European story. From theirs, they may have felt less like a lost civilization and more like families who simply ran out of room to maneuver in a world that kept getting colder and farther away. Their disappearance left almost no written trace. What we have instead are bones, ruins, and questions. One of the quiet pleasures of this series is lingering with those questions. And if you enjoy sinking into these unsolved corners of the past as you fall asleep, there's a book that goes even deeper into them out now at Sleepy-Time History. Come with a discount this week. The north of Greenland remind us that not every ending is dramatic. Sometimes a society can hold on bravely, adapt part way, and still be undone when climate, trade, and identity pull in different directions. In the next story, we'll cross back to the heart of a continent, to another community that rose, flourished, and then ebbed away along the wide, slow waters of the Mississippi. 9. Cahokia's contraction in the Mississippi Valley. If Greenland was the lonely edge of a world fraying apart, Cahokia was almost the opposite, a place where everything came together so tightly that for a while it must have felt like the center of the earth. Imagine the broad Mississippi bottomlands 1,000 years ago, not the industrial river of barges and levees, but a slow, meandering giant splitting and rejoining through a maze of channels and backwaters. Each spring the waters rose and spread out, leaving behind rich silt. For anyone who knew how to plant in that soil, it was like farming on a living flood of fertilizer. Into that landscape around the year 1050, something extraordinary happened. Small village communities that had dotted the river valleys for generations began to rearrange themselves. People moved closer together. Fields spread. Mounds grew. Over the span of a few human lifetimes, a loose scatter of farming hamlets coalesced into what archaeologists call Cahokia, the largest urban center north of Mesoamerica, a city of earth and pyramids, broad plazas and dense neighborhoods anchored just across the river from what is now St. Louis. At its height, maybe 10 or 15,000 people lived in and around Cahokia itself, with tens of thousands more in the surrounding countryside. That's not certain, but whatever the exact number, it was enough to transform the valley. Timber was cut, fields were expanded, distant regions were drawn in through trade, from the Ozarks, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast. The city's leaders built massive platform mounds, the largest of them, Monk's Mound, covering more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Around some plazas, they erected wooden palisades and great circles of posts that may have marked out celestial events. For a while it worked. Then the ground itself started keeping a different kind of record. Beneath later houses and streets, archaeologists find thin, distinct layers of silt and sand, flood deposits interrupted by layers of human occupation. Some are modest, the kind that might follow an ordinary spring rise. Others are thicker, coarser, the unmistakable signature of big water sweeping across low ground. Taken together, they suggest that the communities around Cahokia were living with a river that could suddenly become much more than a backdrop. A field that yields corn one year might be buried in sand the next. A neighborhood carefully laid out near a channel could find itself in the path of a new course after a major flood. In some places you can read this in the sequence of layers. Flood, rebuilding, flood again. Then houses shifted onto slightly higher, safer ground. The timing is suggestive. Around the same centuries when Cahokia was growing rapidly, climate records from tree rings and lake sediments show signs of changing rainfall patterns in the Midwest. Some years brought intense downpours, others longer spells of dryness. For a city that relied on stable harvests from floodplain fields to feed thousands of mouths, that kind of variability was more than an inconvenience. It was a pressure that never quite let up. Inside the city, the evidence for that pressure shows up in quieter ways. Early Cahokian neighborhoods seem to have been arranged in orderly patterns, with houses grouped around courtyards, aligned on shared axes pointing toward major mounds and plazas. Later on, those patterns begin to fray. House orientations shift. Yards get subdivided. Some areas are abandoned, and others suddenly fill in more densely. Archaeologists read these changes as signs of reorganization, people moving, reshuffling, making new decisions about who lives near whom and where. In some sectors, large, well-built structures, give way to smaller, more cramped houses, as if extended families were squeezing more people into less space or new arrivals were being fitted wherever there was room. Food remains tell a similar story. Early rubbish pits show plenty of maize, but also diverse wild resources: fish, deer, nuts, waterfowl. Over time, in some contexts, the balance shifts toward heavier dependence on maize, a crop that can feed many but also locks you more tightly to stable weather and reliable floods. Charcoal from fire pits hints at more intensive use of nearby forests, as timber had to be cut over and over for buildings, fuel, and the great wooden palisades that ringed part of the central precinct. All of this suggests a city running closer and closer to its environmental limits. A little like the Greenland Norse, relying on just enough hay to get their animals through winter, Cahokia's people may have found themselves counting on each year's harvests and river behavior with a precision that left little room for error. And when the errors came, the bad flood, the failed crop, the year when fish runs were poor, those quiet neighborhood reorganizations may have been the first visible response. Families shifting uphill, clusters of houses forming in new patterns, some districts hollowing out while others became more crowded. The soil records the floods, the post holes record the moves. By the late 1100s and into the 1200s, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Important areas inside Cahokia are being rebuilt, then abandoned, then repurposed again, like a city constantly trying to rearrange itself around problems that never fully resolve. How the people inside those houses understood what was happening, whether they blamed the river, the weather, the spirits, or each other, is harder to see. But in the next part of this story, the traces left behind begin to hint at stress that was no longer just environmental, but social as well. The social hints begin with something that looks at first glance like a fence. Running around part of Cahokia's central precinct is a long, carefully built palisade. Rows of posts set side by side in a trench, reinforced and renewed more than once. It wasn't just a decorative boundary. It took enormous labor and a constant supply of timber to maintain. People have argued about what it meant. Some see it as a defensive wall, a sign that danger, real or perceived, had come close enough that the city's leaders felt they had to fortify the core. Others think it may have marked out a sacred inner space controlling, who could move in and out, separating the mounds and plazas where elites performed rituals from the neighborhoods where most people lived and worked. It might have been both at once. A wall can keep enemies out. It can also keep people in. There are traces of burned structures around parts of this palisade, and in some outlying areas layers of charcoal and debris that hint at fires more intense than a simple house accident. They could be the remains of ritual burnings, structures deliberately cleared and cleansed. Or they could be the scars of conflict, raids, uprisings, episodes where tension that had been building quietly finally broke the surface. Cahokia's reach had always depended on relationships with the smaller communities scattered up and down the rivers, villages that supplied food, labor, and perhaps tribute. As the city's environmental margins narrowed, those relationships may have become harder to manage. If the central elite demanded more maize to feed ceremonies and construction crews, while harvests in the countryside were becoming less predictable, every request carried more weight. A demand that was tolerable in a good year might feel like a threat in a bad one. One way to read the archaeology of the region in the 1200s and 1300s is as a slow loosening of Cahokia's grip. Sites that once bore the clear imprint of Cahokian influence, similar pottery, similar house plans, similar mound layouts begin to drift away from that style. New ceremonial centers appear in places that had once been peripheral, as if local leaders were choosing to build their own smaller versions of what Cahokia had once offered, rather than sending people and surplus back to the big city. Within the urban core itself, those repeated episodes of rebuilding and abandonment suggest something similar on a neighborhood scale. House clusters disappear and reappear in different configurations. Some courtyards, once carefully maintained, fill in with refuse and then lie quiet. Public spaces that must have required coordinated effort to keep up start to look neglected. It's as if step by step the ability or the willingness to act together on a large scale was fraying. In that kind of atmosphere, conflict doesn't have to look like a single great battle. It can feel more like a series of small refusals and quiet breaks. A village that doesn't send workers one season. A neighborhood that resists a new ritual rule. A group that chooses without fanfare to pack up and move downriver rather than accept another year of short rations and heavy obligations. By the time European chroniclers first heard stories from the Mississippi Valley, centuries later they encountered societies that remembered powerful mound centers and great gatherings. But they didn't point to a single living city like Cahokia. Instead, they spoke of many towns, many chiefs, a landscape of regional powers rather than one overwhelming hub. Archaeology suggests that this transition, the shift from a heavily centralized Cahokian world to a looser constellation of smaller communities, didn't happen overnight. It unfolded over generations through countless individual decisions: where to plant, whom to marry, which leaders to support, when to leave. Some people probably stayed almost to the end, living in the shadow of mounds whose original builders they knew only from stories. Others left early, taking with them fragments of Cahokian ritual, art, and memory, and weaving them into new local traditions upriver, downriver, and across the prairies. By around 1350, the great central precinct that had once held tens of thousands was largely empty. The mounds remained, but the dense neighborhoods around them had thinned or vanished. Floods still came. Seasons still turned. But the city that had tried to organize so much of that river world into one concentrated experiment in urban life was over. Its disappearance wasn't an apocalypse in the cinematic sense. No single disaster erased it in a single season. Instead, many smaller pressures, rising waters, shifting rains, strained forests, fraying alliances, local grievances, worked together over time, loosening the ties that held people in one place. What they left behind was not a vanished people, but a changed landscape of communities, more scattered, more autonomous, tied together by shared histories and ceremonial practices, but no longer drawn into one overwhelming center. If you drift to sleep imagining Cahokia, you might picture it at dusk, not at its moment of triumphant construction, but near the end, when the fires still burn on the mounds, but some of the house clusters around them are already dark. Footpaths leading outward are more heavily worn than the avenues within. Somewhere beyond the horizon, new gatherings are beginning in smaller plazas under different stars. Centuries later, those mounds would puzzle European settlers. They would ask who built them, as if the answer had been erased. But for the descendants of the people who lived there, the story never really vanished. It moved out along the rivers into new towns, into oral traditions and sacred geographies. Like so many of the places in this list, Cahokia didn't simply fall. It transformed, dissolved into a wider fabric of life that outlived the city itself. The mounds stand as silent witnesses, and the river keeps flowing past, carrying rumors of a time when, in the middle of the Mississippi Valley, people briefly gathered in numbers and complexity that would not be seen again there for many centuries. And if you ever want to wander more slowly through stories like this, there's a book waiting for you at Sleepy Time History.com with a quiet little discount running this week. For now, just let the image of those earthen pyramids fade behind your eyelids as we turn in the next chapter to another world that rose, shimmered for a moment, and then was gone. 10. The Minoan palace states destroyed by fire and upheaval. We leave the urn mounds of the Mississippi Valley and drift back across the ocean and across the centuries to a very different kind of center of power. Here the hills are stone, the air smells of the sea, and the heart of the kingdom is not a plaza ringed with earthworks, but a palace, thick-walled, terrace, painted with bright scenes of chariots, lions, and long-haired warriors, places with names that echo through Greek legend, though the people who lived there never called themselves by those later names. Minapios, Tirans. At their height, these weren't just big houses, they were the nerve centers of entire regions. From the outside they looked like fortresses, massive cyclopean walls, gates framed by carved stone animals, megarons with great central hearths where rulers sat and gave orders. On the inside, their power ran through something much more fragile. Clay tablets, hundreds of them, maybe thousands at a time, inscribed with a script we call Linear B, lists of sheep and pigs, records of oil and wine, notes about bronze chariots, chariot wheels, women assigned to particular shrines, rations for workers, offerings for gods. Each tablet was part of a web of information. Who owed what? Who controlled which fields? Who was being prepared for war? Who was weaving cloth for the palace storerooms? Together they formed a bureaucratic nervous system pulsing through the palaces in a language of numbers and signs. And then almost all at once, in historical terms, that system stopped. The way we know this is not from stories. It's from fire. At Piaios on the western coast of the Pelpine, archaeologists digging down through centuries of soil hit a stark layer, a burn horizon. Above it, the scattered scraps of later, simpler occupation. Below it, the carefully laid floors and storms of the palace world. In that layer, in room after room, they found the same pattern. Collapsed roofs, charred beams, rubble mixed with carbonized grain, broken vessels fused to the floor by heat, and in the ashes, those clay tablets. Normally the records of the Minoan palaces were temporary. Clay was cheap. Writing was for keeping track of the current year, the current season. Once a transaction was finished, a delivery made, an obligation fulfilled, the tablet might be wiped clean and used again, or simply left to crumble. Clay hardens only when it is fired, so the only reason we can read their accounts at all is that their offices burned. At Piaios, it seems the flames came fast and hot. The clay ceilings and walls, the wooden beams, the stacked stores of oil and textiles, all fed the blaze. Temperatures rose high enough to bake the tablets where they lay on shelves and tables, freezing in place the last weeks or months of palace administration. There are hints of haste in those final texts, extra entries squeezed in, references to watchers on the coast, inventories of weapons and armor that look less like routine bookkeeping and more like emergency musters. But the most striking thing is what comes after. Nothing like it. After the fire that tore through Piaios, there is no new layer of tablets, no rebuilt archive. The palace complex is not restored as it had been. What remains are scattered houses, rougher pottery, simpler tools. The old, dense tangle of recorded obligations and centralized control does not reappear. The same pattern repeats at other sites. At Mar, the hilltop citadel shows multiple phases of construction and modification. Then, for the period that interests us, a sharp moment, destruction by fire, again a burn layer, fragments of walls reddened and cracked by heat, fallen stones, scattered riches pressed into the ash. At Tyrins and other centers across mainland Greece, archaeologists find similar horizons, thick bands of charcoal and rubble that mark a clear before and after. Above them life continues, but thinner, poorer, less organized around palatial hubs, where there had been a network of palace states, each with its own bureaucracy, each plugged into long distance trade routes that reached into the Iron and beyond. There is suddenly a break in the record. The script of power itself, Linear B, disappears. No more clay tablets listing out sheep by the hund. No more tidy columns of grain allocations. No more written evidence of the men who rode in chariots or the women attached to particular sanctuaries. For centuries afterward, in the same landscapes, people still farm, still herd, still fight, and make offerings to gods. But they do so without leaving this kind of written trail. To later Greeks, the age of the great palaces becomes a distant memory wrapped in song and myth. For us, what remains is the archaeology of that moment when the old order burned. Charcoal in the cracks between stones, melted plaster where fresco once showed processions and feasts, and in the ashes of storage rooms and archives, the accidental library of a world that did not expect to vanish. In the next part, we can linger among those ruins a little longer and follow the traces backward and outward toward whatever forces, human or natural, pushed the Minoan palaces to that final fiery edge. If you stand in those ruins in your mind for a moment, in the quiet, after the fire, the obvious question rises and hangs in the smoke. What did this? One old answer is simple. Someone attacked. Later, Greek poetry is full of sieges and sackings, of cities burned and palaces looted. For a long time it was easy to imagine that the end of Pios Myes and the others came at the hands of some outside enemy. Raiders from across the sea, displaced warriors from elsewhere in the collapsing Bronze Age world, bands of hungry men looking at the packed stores and high walls of the palaces and seeing a target. There are hints that fit this story. Those watchers on the coast mentioned in the last tablets from Pyos, the emergency-sounding inventories of weapons and armor, the fact that some destruction levels contain signs of looting, smashed vessels, scattered valuables that look less like accidental loss and more like frantic rummaging. In this vision you can picture it, a night when signals flare along the headlands, messengers run up the stone ramps to the megarum, doors are barred, weapons are handed out. The ruler and his officials, used to controlling everything through inkless lists on wet clay, suddenly facing a crisis that can't be balanced in any column. Maybe the attackers are local rivals. Another palace, another king taking advantage of weakness. Maybe they are people from beyond the Minoan world, part of the wider waves of movement we see at the end of the Bronze Age, when cities from Anatolia to the Levant are falling. We don't know. What we can say is that the destruction wasn't cleanly surgical. The palaces went down, but so did much of the system that supported them. That has led some scholars to another set of culprits. The Earth itself, the Minoan heartlands, sit in a seismically active zone. Greece is stitched with fault lines. Earthquakes here are not rare, and evidence for them is written into the stones. In some palaces, the destruction layers show walls tipped in one direction, blocks shifted off their foundations in ways that look more like shaking than battering rams. At Tyrins and other sites, there are traces of earlier quakes, followed by rebuilding signs that the people of the palaces were no strangers to the ground moving under them. A powerful enough earthquake could do more than topple a few walls. It could crack water systems, destroy storerooms, bring down roofs onto hoarded grain and oil. If tremors hit repeatedly over a short span of years, they could strain the resources of even a rich bureaucracy. Repairs would cost labor, timber, stone. Fields disrupted by landslides or damaged irrigation might yield less. People already living close to subsistence might find themselves pushed over the edge. In that scenario, fire might come not from attackers, but from the way collapsed buildings and spilled oil turn any spark into a blaze. The burn layers we see could be the final stage of a disaster that began when the ground heaved. And yet, earthquakes alone don't quite explain the pattern either. If the problem were only seismic, we might expect the palaces to be rebuilt in much the same way they had been after earlier quakes. But after this wave of destruction, that doesn't happen. The administrative style, the written records, the tight grip of palace officials on regional production all fade away. That points to a third element, the possibility that the real crisis was inside the system. For generations, the palaces had been gathering resources from their surrounding territories, redistributing food, raw materials, and labor. This kind of centralized system can look very stable right up until the moment it isn't. It depends on trust and fear and a shared belief that the palace will always be able to deliver what it promises. Imagine a run of bad harvests, perhaps tied to climate fluctuations we only see now in distant cores of mud or ice. Imagine trade routes fraying, ships not arriving with copper or tin as reliably as before, foreign markets buying less oil or cloth. Under those conditions, the palace storehouses would start to feel less like symbols of abundance and more like hoards taken from people who were hungry. Taxes might feel heavier, obligations more resented. Local elites who had long cooperated with the palace might start to pull away, keeping more for themselves, listening less to scribes and officials. There are archaeological hints that social strain was building even before the final fires. Some fortification walls were strengthened, extended, or rebuilt in the decades leading up to the destructions, as if rulers were nervously shoring up defenses. Weapons appear in graves in greater numbers. Some sites show high starters' burials clustered in new ways. Perhaps evidence of shifting power structures, new factions forming. All this suggests a world where the palace order was already wobbling. In such a world, an earthquake or a raid, or even a rumor of invasion, might be enough to push things past a tipping point. Internal uprisings become more thinkable when confidence in the center drops, a group that had once been carefully counted on the clay tablets. Farmers, laborers, lower-ranking warriors might stop seeing the palace as protector and start seeing it as the problem. Some scholars have imagined scenes of palace burnings that are less about foreign conquest and more about local reckoning. Fire not as collateral damage, but as deliberate eraser of a resented institution. Again, the evidence is ambiguous. We do not have clear signs of mass slaughter in the destruction layers. No unambiguous markers of civil war. But the way the system disappears so completely in so many places hints that what failed was not just stone and mortar, but the very idea of rule embodied in those buildings. Most likely, the ending of the Minoan palaces was not the work of a single cause, but of several threads tightening together. The broader Late Bronze Age world was shaking. Trade routes that had tied Greece to Cyprus, Egypt, and Anatolia were fluctuating under the pressure of migrations, wars, and climate stress. Earthquakes rattled the landscape. Local tensions simmered in the shadow of walls that had once felt reassuring and now felt confining. A raid at the wrong moment in this mix. A tremor under foundations already cracked by mistrust. A year of crop failure, when the storerooms were not as full as the people had been led to believe, and the palace might become a bonfire. In that sense, the burn horizons at Pios Mais and elsewhere are less like the smoking gun of a single catastrophe and more like the last flare of a long, slow unraveling. From the vantage point of centuries later, early Greek poets would sing about mighty kings and heroic sieges, about cities sacked and palaces taken. Their stories might preserve distant echoes of these real destructions folded into myth. From our vantage point, reading baked tablets and sifting ash, what we see instead is a reminder of how fragile complex systems can be when many kinds of stress converge. Power that seems absolute can turn out to be balanced on narrow supports. A few good harvests in a row, a stable climate, trade winds that keep blowing, a population still willing to pay the tax collector. Take away too many of those supports at once, and even the thickest stone walls can't keep the fire out. If you'd like to wander deeper into stories like this, civilizations at their heights and the long, quiet ways they end, there's a full-length companion book waiting at Sleepy Time History, com with a discount running this week. For now, let the palaces fade, the fresco crumble, the scribes lay down their styluses. The last tablet, still damp with fresh impressions, sits on a shelf that will soon collapse into flame. Above the ruins, the hills and the sea remain. Shepherds lead flocks past fallen stones. Children grow up hearing faint tales of an age of great houses and greater kings already half legend in their grandparents' voices. And over time, the memory of what was once counted so carefully on clay dissolves into myth and then into silence. In that silence, across the world and across the ages, other centers rise and fall, other systems strain and snap. The night deepens, and the long procession of vanished worlds drifts by, one after another, until all that's left is the soft sound of our own breathing, and the faint awareness that even endings, however fiery, are only chapters in a much longer story. Tonight we walk through some of those chapters. The whitewashed courts of Noah's under a darkening sky waiting for the wave from Thera. The dust-laden winds over Akkad as canals silted and kings lost their grip. Harappa's neat streets slowly emptying as rivers wandered away. Anka's reservoirs cracking under the strain of too much water, then too little. Mesa's cliff dwellings, Cahokia's mounds, the Norse farms in Greenland, the Maya lowlands thickening with drought and smoke, and finally the palaces of my turning from centers of power into heaps of cooled ash. Each one felt singular, local, rooted in its own soil and sky. Yet beneath them, the same quiet patterns moved, climate shifting a little too far, systems stretched a little too thin, Stories about how the world works failing just when they were needed most. If you'd like to drift further into those patterns and into the deeper prehistoric crises that almost erased us before history even began, there's a book waiting for you at Sleepy Time History. Com with a discount running this week. Before you go, gently tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Tell me too where you're listening from, so this scattered little meta-population of late-night historians can find itself on the map. For now, let the questions soften, civilizations fall, landscapes heal, stories remain, and we add our own quietly in the dark.